I was in high school the first time I went out to Inks Lake with a friend. If you've ever been out there, you know there is a wonderful spot from which you can throw yourself off of a cliff, or if you're really brave, a boulder that sits on top of the cliff into the water below. And I had friends that had gone out there and done that cliff jumping in the past. And we got there, and it was wintertime when we went. We were camping out, and so the water was extraordinarily cold, but we stood there on the top of the cliff, and I had heard that you could jump off this cliff. I knew people who had jumped off that cliff into that water, and as I stood on the side of the cliff looking into the water, it occurred to me the difference between belief and faith. I believed you could jump off the cliff into the water and be fine, but the line between belief and faith runs through trust. Doesn't it? I mean, intellectually, I understood the premise that I knew people who had thrown themselves off this cliff into that water, and they lived to tell the tale. But that's different than being willing to throw yourself off the cliff into the water below. In the end, it took the person that was with me, the other guys, jumping first, because they had been there before, they had seen it, they had done it, and so they knew there was not, a spike or a rock or something below that would hamper their ability to safely survive the jump. And so once I saw them go into the water, now I had trust. Now I had faith. I was still terrified, but I assumed I would survive, and so eventually, of course, I also threw myself off the cliff, which is probably another sermon about boys being allowed to go to Inks Lake by themselves. But in Mark's gospel, this is the difference between belief and faith, and it's trust. And the gospel that Jesus is proclaiming and the works that Jesus is doing, the faith that Jesus is teaching, is one designed to move people to a place of trust, where what they see and what they hear does more than just shape their belief. It shapes the way they choose to live their life. Jesus is inviting people to see the miracles and to hear the teaching and to believe in a way that crosses the line into faith, crosses through trust, invites people to throw themselves off of the cliff into the waters of faith below. It begins to happen as Jesus goes along. It begins to take place that people hear the teaching of Jesus matched with the works of Jesus, and their belief begins to go from an intellectual assent into trust that begins to shape their lives, their decision making, how they experience the people and the world around them. In today's lesson from chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel, we actually get two stories for the price of one, but they're related to one another. In fact, one story takes place while the other story is taking place. It's placed right in the center of a larger narrative that relates to a father and his sick child. Open up your Bible to chapter 5, verse 21, so that you can follow along with me. We're going to move into the text, and then we'll pop in and out to make sure we understand what's happening here. So chapter 5, verse 21. Open up your Bible, chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. We've seen this repeated again and again and again, yes? That a large crowd is crammed in and around Jesus. They want to see him, they want to hear him, they want to be close to what it is that he is doing. And so Jesus has a large crowd pressing and gathered around him, and it says in verse 22, then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. A couple of interesting things are taking place here. Jairus, who is a synagogue leader, comes on the scene where Jesus is being pressed by the crowd, and he sees Jesus, and he makes his way up to Jesus, and he falls at his feet. Notice, evidently the crowd parted for Jairus. The crowd just kind of melted back as he approached. You have a sense in which he didn't even have to break stride, because he was a synagogue leader. He came dressed the part, no doubt, and people saw him coming. And here was a man who had authority and stature in society such that when he approaches and he's clearly making his way somewhere, I'll step out of the way. You know, there are those people that we have in our lives. When you see them striding down the hallway, you recognize a power differential. And if one person is going to step to the side, it's going to be me. This is one of those guys. Even though the crowd is pressed and pushing up against Jesus, this is someone for whom others make way. And so Jairus comes into the scene. He sees Jesus. He strides towards him. The crowd melts away. And then something extraordinary happens. He falls at Jesus' feet. So one to whom others show deference is now showing deference to Jesus. All pretense, flowing robe, decorum, stature out the window. Jairus, to whom the crowd shows deference, now shows deference to Jesus, and he falls at his feet. We should be paying attention because something extraordinary is taking place. Synagogue rulers and leaders would have been more likely to summon someone else into their presence to give account. Or if they wanted to ask them something, they would simply summon them to themselves. But now this man has sought Jesus out, and when he saw him and he found him, he made a beeline to him. The crowd parted, and he fell at Jesus' feet. Verse 23, it says, he pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. Now we see what's going on. Now we see what's happening in Jairus' heart and in his mind and his life that causes him to ignore the decorum of his position and power and to be willing to submit and humble himself before Jesus in front of the crowd. Don't you know that when he threw himself down on his knees, a murmur went through the crowd? What is happening here? That's Jairus. That we step out of his way. But now look, he's thrown himself on his face in front of Jesus. He has just humbled himself in front of the rabbi. And as the murmur dies down and their ears tune in, they hear Jairus say why. And if you're a parent, you totally get it. If your child is sick, if your child is dying, you do anything, everything necessary. You don't care anymore about position, title, what someone else is going to say about you or not say. If your child is under threat, you do whatever is necessary to protect and care for them. And so that's what Jairus does. Jairus would have been aware of Jesus. They were having conversations about him in the synagogue and among the leaders and the rulers and the Pharisees. He would have been hearing his colleagues and peers talking about this rabble-raising rabbi who's going from town to town and he's healing sick people. And what are we going to do about it? He's overturning convention, and what are we going to do about it? He is a threat to our way of life, and what are we going to do about it? But when his daughter gets sick, all he knows is that guy's been healing people and I need that for my kid, and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. What I want you to read and hear is Jairus was willing to throw himself off the cliff into the water. He jumped from belief into faith. He didn't quietly send a back channel messenger to Jesus. I want you to heal him, but I don't want anyone to know. I don't want anybody to know that I've approached you or prayed or asked or believe that you can change this situation. No, he jumped from belief into faith through the channel of trust, and he said, Jesus, I trust that you can do what no one else can. And I don't care who hears it, because I'm desperate. And so he puts his trust in Jesus. Verse 24, so Jesus went with him. Can you hear this, see this from the beginning? Jesus responds to trust. He responds to those who are willing to take the leap into trust. To do more than just believe intellectually. Yes, I give assent to the idea that Jesus can change the circumstances. But what he responds to is the person who says, I am going to jump off this cliff and believe that you can change the circumstances of whatever is below, no matter what. And so while I'm in the air, if there's a problem, I trust you're going to fix it. Because I don't know what's coming and I can't see below the water, but I trust you with my life. That's what Jairus does. If it ruins him in the synagogue, he doesn't care. He doesn't know what's going to happen. But he trusts that Jesus can do something for his daughter, and Jesus responds. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. Okay, so this is story number one. It's now underway. You've got Jairus up here, for whom the crowd parts, and he trusts in Jesus. And Jesus responds and goes. We're going to pick back up with Jairus and his daughter. But while they're on their way, Mark places in the center of that story yet another testimony that is different, but the same. Verse 25. A woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. If you have suffered long from infirmity and disease, you can begin to appreciate the woman's circumstance and situation. If you have maxed out, you're maxed out of pocket year after year after year, and still not really getting better, you can begin to understand this woman's situation. For 12 years, she had been bleeding. For 12 years, she had life draining out of her drop by drop by drop. And even more than that, not only did she have a physical ailment, but her particular physical ailment would have made her ceremonially unclean. In other words, you can't approach God because clearly you are unholy in some way that God has smitten you like this. So for 12 years, she has spent all she has. She's just sold her car, sold her house. Well, she didn't have a car, but, she sold her donkey. I don't know. Whatever it was, and you do that, I mean, you do whatever it takes when you are sick. You do whatever it takes. And she did everything that she could think of. She exhausted herself with every cure known to man and was now broke. So, not only is she broke, not only is she disappointed, not only is she ostracized and pushed to the margins, but she's still sick. She's still suffering. No one's getting out of the way for her. Can you hear me? The crowd is not going to part for this woman. In fact, she's the one that has to move out of everyone else's way. She's the one who needs to step aside when someone is coming by. And here comes the rabbi with Jairus, the synagogue ruler, at his side. As they are walking towards Jairus' house, this woman comes up, and in verse 27 it says, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. You know, that's the difference there between Jairus and this woman, isn't it? People see Jairus come, the crowd parts, he walks up to Jesus' face. This woman knows no one's moving aside for her, and in fact, if they recognize who she is, they're going to push her to the side. They're going to make sure that she doesn't get anywhere close. So she comes up behind Jesus, I'm sure she's just like keeping her head down. She's like, if I can just sneak up behind Jesus and touch his cloak. This is what's in her mind. This is what's in her heart. I will crawl on my hands and knees between their legs to come up behind him if that's what it takes. She too is desperate. Verse 28, the reason why is because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. She's like, I'm jumping off the cliff. I am going to trust that by hook or crook, if I can just get up and touch Jesus, I will be healed. If I can just be touched by his grace, my life will change and it will never be the same again. And so she was going to do whatever she was going to defy convention. She was going to defy the standard of the day. She didn't care about her dignity. It was totally surrendered. And she said, I don't even have to talk to him. I don't have to take up his time. I just know that if I am in the presence of Jesus, I trust that I'm going to be okay. So I just have to fling myself at him in any way that I can. And she crawls up behind him and she touches his clothes. Listen to this, verse 29. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Jesus responds to trust. Jesus responds to trust. She put her trust in him and she was not disappointed. Verse 30, at once Jesus realized power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You know, it's funny. For at least a season of my life, I read this like some of you might. Who touched my clothes? Because for me, if you take some of my power, I have less power. That would be rude. How dare you take some of my power, right? How dare you take without asking? And I know there are some in this room who also probably, at least in their mind, are reading it in this way, that Jesus is spinning around to discipline the person who has snuck up behind him to try to take something from him that doesn't belong to them. And obviously, his disciples are kind of reading it in the same way. They say, you see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and with trembling and fear told him the whole truth. So to her horror, Jesus was not going to let this go. Who touched my clothes? Jesus, don't worry about it. Just keep moving. What does it matter? She's like, no, we're not moving another step until I get to meet the person who snuck up behind me and touched my clothes. Not because he was upset with her, but friends, I think he was impressed by her. I think he wanted to meet her. He didn't want her whole experience with Jesus to be grabbing the cloak while she was kneeling at his rear end. He had another side to show her. And so he flipped around. Who did that? Who was that? Come on. And the woman in the crowd, head down, like, did he know it was me? Does he know it was me? Is he talking to me? Is he going to let this go? Can they just move on? I don't want to be in the spotlight. Suddenly realized, there's no getting around it. So she's like, it was me. And she does what Jairus did. I mean, she just throws herself at his feet. She knew she was healed in her body. I don't even know how to describe what she had to have been feeling, the type of elation in that moment. I mean, can you imagine your infirmity every day of your life and suddenly in an instant it's just gone? I mean, I know how I feel after I've been doing yard work and I take some ibuprofen. I'm like, I think I'm 25 again. That's all right. But that's nothing. That's nothing. 12 years every day, life draining out of you. Your whole life ruined, all your money gone, isolated from society. And suddenly, you know in your body, I'm better. She had to have been feeling so great. And she just says, it was me. Here's the whole truth. I have been suffering for 12 years. I've exhausted myself. No one will look at me. No one will talk to me. I have to move to the other side of the road when anybody comes along. And I heard you were coming down the road, so I stuck up behind you to grab your cloak. I jumped off the cliff because I trusted that you would be good. And he looked at her in verse 35. He said, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Whew. How dare she come and take something that doesn't belong to her? And Jesus' response is, my grace belongs to you, daughter. It's for you. My grace is for you. I want you to touch grace. I want you to experience the touch of grace in your life. And I don't care if you find it face to face or kneeling behind me, holding on to my... I want you to experience, to touch my grace. And you step through the door of trust, believing that if you just flung yourself in my direction, I would catch you. And so that's it. That's enough. Here's my grace and it's yours. It is for you. That's why I've come. Now, verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Remember him? And they said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? They came and said, look, it's too late. Maybe if he would have walked a little faster. Maybe if that woman wouldn't have stopped him. How many minutes did that take? But it's too late now, so just let him go back to what he was doing before. People will tell you that, by the way. It's too late. You had a chance to have grace, but you missed it. Missed your chance. Should have taken it when you had it. But Jesus got busy loving on somebody else and you missed your turn. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, don't be afraid, just go and believe. And he didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with the people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child's not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him. They laughed at him. Because, listen, they knew a dead person when they saw one. people died in homes. People died in the family. I mean, many of us have never been with someone who has died because we do death differently now. But then, sick people were tended to right there. And so they knew death. They were not unfamiliar with the phenomenon, and they certainly knew the difference between asleep and dead, and so they laughed. Poor guy. He hadn't even seen her yet. We have. After he put them all out, he's like, if that's what you think, move on out. You think that's the end? Why don't you just go on outside? He took the child's father and mother and his disciples who were with him, and he went into where the child was. He took her by the hand, and he said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Yeah. When's the last funeral you went to that somebody got up out of the box and started walking around? I've done a lot of funerals. I have not seen that one yet. And so they were completely astonished, and he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is an aside that if it was not a communion Sunday, I'd have more time to talk about. But I'm just going to point it out. Anytime resurrection happens, there's always this get something to eat. So I don't know if death makes you hungry or if they're just proving it's not a ghost. But either way, there's always food involved, which kind of makes me excited about heaven too, you know? Because like, on the other side of the resurrection, I'll be like, Lord, I need you to prove that I'm really alive. You got any brisket up in this joint? You know what I mean? Okay, that's an aside I don't have time for. But just think about it. Huh? Talitha kum. Girl, get up. You ain't done yet. Grace is here. Grace is reaching out to touch your hand and call you back into life. This is one thing I want you to not miss about this. That little girl did not put her trust in Jesus that we're aware of. She was a sick 12-year-old girl who died. But grace came and reached out and grabbed her by the hand. The woman on her who came to Jesus, she reached out and grabbed grace, and grace was given. In this case, grace just reached out into the grave and grabbed her. Because the truth of the matter is, once you're dead, there ain't nothing you can do about it anymore. That's it. Either grace reaches in and grabs you by the hand and calls you to life, or he doesn't. Jairus, he had trust. Even after they came and said, it's over, there is no more, there's nothing past death. Jesus said, don't worry about all that nonsense, let's go. Jairus, okay, I am flying through the air now. I am headed for the water, but I'm going to keep trusting. It feels like there's probably a big rock under that water. But I'm with you, Jesus. I'm with you, Jesus. Let's go. I trust. Maybe he trusted that whether his little girl stood up or did not, it was going to be okay because grace was there. And he wasn't wrong. Two people touched by grace. They had a few things in common, and I will offer them to you. Number one, they humbled themselves before the Lord Jesus Christ. They knelt in his presence, and they spoke their need to him. And two, they trusted in his grace and in his goodness. And both were touched by grace in ways that changed their lives. And neither was ever the same again. This morning, our response as a people is to kneel before Jesus and humble ourselves. To take a flying leap off the cliff and say, Jesus, I trust you with whatever is in the waters below. I'm with you.